In 2010, a geneticist in Leipzig read a sequence off a bone fragment and found something that should not have been there. What Svante Pabo published, that May would dismantle everything the 20th century had taught about where every living person on Earth came from. The sequence came from 3 bone fragments recovered in a Croatian cave, ground into powder, and read against the genomes of 5 living people drawn from 5 continents. The comparison was designed to show a clean separation between 2 species that had shared a continent for tens of thousands of years. It showed overlap instead, in every one of the 5. Between 1 and 4% of the genome of everyone outside Africa is not our own. It came from a population we were told died out. It came from a population we were told was separate. It came from a population we were told we replaced. And it is sitting in about 6 billion living bodies. Replacement was the whole model, and for 30 years it was the settled one. Modern humans arose in Africa. They spread outward. They met other human populations already living across Eurasia and outcompeted them. Those populations went extinct without issue, leaving nothing behind but stone tools and bones in the ground. The story had a name, Out of Africa with Complete Replacement, and it was taught as the resolved version of a debate that had already been won, and the replacement was never actually complete. The mixing was not a rare event at the edges of 2 ranges. There is no clean species boundary anywhere in the data, no sterile hybrid generation, no barrier of the kind that separates a horse from a donkey, no point at which the 2 lineages stopped producing children who went on to have children of their own. The line the textbooks drew is not in the genome anywhere. The interbreeding happened repeatedly, in more than one region, across thousands of years. The descendants were fertile enough that their DNA sits in a majority of the people alive right now, 40,000 years after the last of them died. Then the picture widened again. Populations in Oceania carry a separate contribution from an entirely different archaic group. Some African populations carry signals from a ghost lineage that has never been named because no bone from it has ever been found. Every genome sequence since has added another line to the chart. Every genome sequence since has added another line to the chart. Somebody was here before us. Somebody met us. Somebody is still in us, and nobody knew it until 15 years ago. What that DNA is doing now is the part that stops being history. The Neanderthal sequences in living people are not inert passengers drifting along neutrally. They sit in genes for immune response, for skin and hair, for fat metabolism, for how the body handles cold and low oxygen. Some variants are under active selection today. A Denisovan variant of a gene controlling the oxygen response is carried by nearly all Tibetans and is the reason human beings can live above 4,000 meters. Other archaic variants are associated with elevated risk of depression, of blood clotting, of severe respiratory illness. This is not a fossil record. It is a set of instructions running inside living bodies, inherited from people whose species we cannot agree on, doing work every day in populations that have no idea they are carrying it. Which turns the question back on the record itself, because every archaic population identified so far was found through a bone that happened to survive in a cold cave with the right chemistry, and cold caves are a tiny and wildly unrepresentative fraction of the places human beings actually lived. The ghost lineage detected in African genomes has no bones attached to it at all, only a statistical shadow in living DNA. Nobody went looking for it. It turned up in an equation. How many populations are inside us that left nothing to dig up? And how would anyone ever put a face to them? Nobody can. Pabo's team recovered roughly 60% of the Neanderthal genome in that first draft, and no living person carries more than a few percent of it. Somebody is still in us. The species we were taught we replaced is distributed in fragments through most of the human population, and there is no individual anywhere you could point at and say that is where it went. Number 2. The species with no face. Number 9. The species with no face. In 2008, a Russian archaeologist bagged a fragment of finger bone from a Siberian cave and filed it as unremarkable. What that fragment turned out to contain would overturn everything the 20th century believed about how many kinds of human being have existed. The bone was the tip of a little finger, taken from a girl, recovered from a layer in Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains, and dated to somewhere between 76 and 52,000 years ago. It was too small a fragment to identify by shape, which meant that nobody handling it could tell whether it had come from a modern human or a Neanderthal. So it went into a bag. So the sequence was read instead, and it matched neither. Not a modern human, not a Neanderthal, not a known population at any point in the fossil record. Not a species anybody had described, named, or predicted, and it had been sitting in a plastic bag in a Novosibirsk collection for 2 years. Species get identified from skulls, and that is not a preference but the entire methodology of the discipline. Paleoanthropology was built on morphology, a brow ridge, a jaw angle. Every human ancestor named before this one was named from bone shape and placed on the family tree according to bone shape. The textbook chart of human evolution is a chart of skulls arranged left to right, and every box on it was drawn from something a researcher could hold up and measure. There has never once been a Denisovan skull anywhere. There is still no Denisovan skull, 16 years later. The entire population is known from a finger bone, a few teeth, a fragment of arm, a jawbone from a Tibetan cave, and a piece of skull too incomplete to reconstruct. No complete cranium, no articulated skeleton, no burial, no portrait of any kind that anybody could put in a textbook, and yet their DNA is present in living people across Melanesia, Papua New Guinea, and Aboriginal Australia, at levels reaching 5%. We can measure their contribution to living bodies with more precision than we can describe their faces. And the record kept getting stranger. One of the individuals sequenced from the cave, a girl now called Denny, turned out to have a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father, which means a first-generation hybrid of two supposedly separate human species was found in the first handful of specimens ever recovered. The one physical trait available in quantity is the one that misleads. Somebody was in that cave for tens of thousands of years. Somebody left almost nothing behind. Somebody is in the genome of millions of people who will never see a picture of them. The teeth are the detail that will not settle. The Denisovan molars recovered from the cave are enormous, larger than Neanderthal teeth, larger than modern human teeth, and closer in size to specimens from hundreds of thousands of years earlier in the hominin record. On morphology alone, they would have been filed as archaic and old, hundreds of thousands of years out of place. The DNA says otherwise. So the morphology actively misleads the analysis the entire discipline was built on, and it does so in the only population where the answer can be checked against a genome. Every other branch of the human family tree was drawn using exactly the method that fails here, and for almost all of those branches there is no DNA left to check the answer against. Which raises the question the field has never resolved. Denisovans occupied a range stretching from Siberia to the Tibetan Plateau and on into island Southeast Asia, across tens of thousands of years, in numbers large enough to leave a genetic mark on populations living thousands of kilometers away from any of it. That is not a marginal group clinging on at the edge of a continent. That is a successful and widespread human population that held ground across half a continent. How does something that widespread leave 5 fragments? And what else was out there leaving nothing at all? Nobody has an answer, and the arithmetic is not encouraging. The total physical remains of an entire human species amount to less material than would fill a coffee cup. Somebody left almost nothing. We have their genome, their range, their contribution to living people, and their tooth measurements, and after 16 years of searching, nobody on Earth can tell you what a Denisovan looked like. Number 3. The bones that say farming made us worse. Number 8. The bones that say farming made us worse. A skeleton on a laboratory table in the Balkans is measurably worse off than the one lying next to it, and it belongs to a farmer. What the bones of the first agricultural populations record is the opposite of the story every school textbook tells about the birth of civilization. The comparison has been run across dozens of sites where hunter-gatherer and early farming populations are buried in the same region. The farmers are shorter, their teeth are full of cavities, their bones carry the marks of iron deficiency, of childhood growth interruption, of infections that would not have spread in a smaller group. In one European sample, the average adult lost about 4 inches of height. 4 inches is not a rounding error in a skeleton, not a local famine, not one bad generation. Not a regional accident somewhere on the edge of the record. And not a decline that reversed quickly, because in parts of Europe, the height lost after farming arrived was not recovered until the 20th century. Progress is the frame the whole period is taught in, and it is built into the vocabulary. The Neolithic Revolution, the rise of agriculture, the dawn of civilization. Farming produced surplus, surplus produced settlement, settlement produced cities and writing and everything after. The hunter-gatherer stage is presented as the thing people escaped from, precarious and hungry and short, and agriculture as the improvement that let human beings finally get on with building something. The skeletons record a fall rather than a rise. Nothing in the physical evidence supports the improvement. No gain in stature, no drop in infant mortality, no reduction in the markers of nutritional stress, no sign of the healthier population that the story requires, and instead, a narrowing of diet from dozens of wild resources to 2 or 3 cereals, which is exactly the change a body records as deficiency. Dental caries appear in populations that had almost none. Tuberculosis and other crowd diseases become visible for the first time, because they need dense settlement and domestic animals to spread. Working hours went up rather than down. Studies of surviving foraging populations found adults spending fewer hours obtaining food than agricultural laborers in the same environments. The trade was not effort for leisure, it was variety and health for volume and reliability. What agriculture produced was more people, living worse, in one place. The population grew because a field feeds more mouths per acre than a forest does, not because any individual mouth was better fed. The bones are the individual record. They say the individual lost. The choice is what makes it uncomfortable rather than merely surprising, because nobody was forced. There was no invasion, no single decision, no moment where a population was compelled to farm. The transition took thousands of years and happened independently in at least 11 separate regions, on different continents, with different crops, among populations that had no contact with one another and no way of copying the idea. Every one of those groups had generations to notice that their children were shorter and their teeth were rotting. And every one of them kept going. Nobody went back. Across 11 independent experiments, the result was the same and the response was the same, which is not what a mistake looks like. So the question is not whether farming was worse for the people doing it, because the skeletons settle that part. The question is what it was better for instead, and the honest answer is that it was better for the population and worse for the person, and those two things are not the same and never have been. Every measure the modern world uses to judge a society, size and density and output and permanence, went up in the archaeological record. Every measure a human body records went down at the same time. Which of those is the improvement? And who exactly was the deal made for? Nobody made it deliberately. 11 independent transitions produced 11 versions of the same outcome, and not one of the populations that made the change reversed it. 4 inches came off the average adult. The story we were taught calls this the moment civilization began, and the people who were alive for it are on record, in their own bones, as having been worse off than their parents. Number 4. The desert that was full of people. Number 7. The desert that was full of people. On a rock wall in the middle of the driest desert on Earth, somebody painted a picture of people swimming. What that wall records is a version of North Africa that no map, no textbook, and no accepted timeline of the region has ever contained. The Cave of Swimmers sits in the Gilf Kebir Plateau on the Egyptian side of the Libyan border, in a region receiving almost no rainfall in an average year. The figures on the wall are horizontal, limbs extended, in postures with no other plausible reading. Elsewhere across the Sahara, the rock art shows cattle herds, hippopotamus, crocodile, elephant, and giraffe. None of those animals can survive there now. Not the hippos, which need permanent standing water. Not the crocodiles. Not the cattle, which need grazing across hundreds of square kilometers. Not the elephants, and not the people who painted them, because the region today cannot support a settled human population anywhere in it. Deserts are supposed to be the deep background of the human story, the fixed and ancient constant the rest of prehistory happens around. The Sahara in particular is taught as a barrier, the thing that separated the Mediterranean world from sub-Saharan Africa. the reason Egypt faced north and east rather than west, the boundary that shaped everything downstream of it. It appears on every map of the ancient world as an empty tan expanse. Nothing in the standard account treats it as a place where anybody lived. The Sahara was green, and it was green recently. It was not green in the geological past. The last African humid period ran from roughly 11,000 to 5,000 years ago, which places it after the last ice age and overlapping the construction of the earliest monumental sites anywhere. Lake sediment cores show standing water where there is now nothing but sand. Radar imaging from orbit has traced river channels running beneath the dunes, complete drainage systems buried under the modern desert. Fossil pollen records grassland where nothing grows. Fish bones and hippopotamus remains have been recovered hundreds of kilometers from any water that exists today, in ground that receives less than a millimeter of rain a year. There are no lakes now. There is no grazing now. There is no drainage now. At Nabta Playa in southern Egypt, a settlement built stone alignments oriented on the solstice, dug wells, herded cattle, and buried those cattle in chambers under the ground, and did all of it around a seasonal lake that has not held water in 5,000 years. Somebody lived out there. Somebody built out there. Somebody watched the water go. The end of it is the part that does not get taught alongside the beginning. The African humid period did not fade evenly. Sediment records from the region indicate a rapid transition, with parts of the change arriving within a few centuries rather than over millennia, and the populations living in the interior had to move. Where they moved is where the record picks them up again. The dates for the drying overlap with the dates for the consolidation of settlement along the Nile, which is the exact point at which Egyptian history is conventionally understood to begin. So the civilization that Western education treats as the starting line of recorded history may sit downstream of an evacuation, and the people who arrived at the river were carrying whatever they had learned somewhere else. Which means the region holds an entire chapter that is not merely undocumented, but physically unreachable. The interior of the Sahara covers roughly 9 million square kilometers, almost none of which has ever been surveyed archaeologically, and most of it lies under sand that moves from year to year. Every site found so far was found because erosion happened to expose it, which is not a survey method but an accident rate, and accident rates do not scale. How many settlements are under the dunes? And what would the story of Egypt look like if any of them were dug? Almost nobody is digging. The region's concerns span borders that have been closed, contested, or actively dangerous for decades, and the surveyed fraction of the Sahara remains a rounding error against its area. Somebody watched the water go. There are people on a wall in the Gilf Kebir swimming through a lake that has been gone for 5,000 years, and the map still shows that place is empty. Number 5. The footprints that broke the timeline. Number 6. The footprints that broke the timeline. In a dry lake bed in New Mexico, somebody walked across wet mud and left prints that should not be that old. What the dating on those prints returned would overturn everything the discipline believed about how and when human beings reached the Americas. The prints were found at White Sands, pressed into the margin of an ancient lake, and there are thousands of them. Most were made by children and adolescents. One track runs almost a mile, made by a young woman carrying a toddler, setting the child down and picking it up again. Seed layers above and below the prints return dates between 23 and 21,000 years ago. 23,000 years is not slightly early, not a few centuries outside the model, not a site at the edge of a distribution that could be trimmed. Not an isolated anomaly, because the prints number in the thousands across multiple surfaces, and not a date that any version of the accepted settlement timeline can absorb. Clovis first was the model, and for most of the 20th century, it was defended like a border. Human beings crossed from Siberia into Alaska near the end of the last ice age, passed south through an ice-free corridor as the glaciers retreated, and appeared across North America around 13,000 years ago. The fluted points turned up everywhere, and nothing older was accepted. Sites claiming greater antiquity were dismissed as contaminated or misdated, and the researchers defending them lost funding. The corridor was closed when those prints were made. There was no route south at that date. The ice sheets were at maximum extent. The corridor did not open for several thousand more years, and the coastal route is itself underwater and largely unexcavated. So the arrival happened by a path that leaves no evidence, at a date when the accepted mechanism did not exist, in a place 3,000 kilometers from the entry point, and the White Sands dates were challenged immediately, on the grounds that the aquatic seeds used could have absorbed ancient carbon and read old. That objection was serious, and it was addressed. A follow-up study dated conifer pollen from the same layers, terrestrial material with no reservoir problem, and separately dated quartz grains by optically stimulated luminescence, a method that measures when a grain last saw sunlight and shares no assumptions with radiocarbon at all. 3 independent methods, none of them sharing an assumption with the others. The same answer from all 3. Somebody was walking there. Somebody was there with children. Somebody was there thousands of years before anyone was supposed to have arrived at all. The children are the detail that changes what the site means. These are not the tracks of a scouting party or a handful of hunters pushing into empty land. Thousands of prints, mostly juvenile, along a lake margin, made over an extended period, is the signature of a resident community going about ordinary business in a place it already knows. Established populations do not appear at the moment of first contact with a continent. They take generations to form, and generations take time nobody has budgeted for, which means the arrival was not at 23,000 years ago, but at some point comfortably before it, in a period for which there is currently no accepted evidence, no proposed route, and no candidate site anywhere in the Americas. And the reason there is no evidence may be procedural rather than actual. For 50 years, North American archaeology largely stopped excavating below the Clovis horizon, because material found down there could not be real, and digging for it ended careers. Sites were closed off at the exact layer where the model said the story began, which means the absence of earlier evidence was partly manufactured by the model that the absence was then used to support. How many pre-Clovis layers were dug through and thrown out? And how many were never dug at all because nobody would fund the digging? Nobody kept count of what got thrown out. The prints survived because they were tracks in gypsum rather than artifacts in soil, which is to say they survived because they were not the kind of thing anybody had been trained to throw away. Somebody was there with children. A woman carried a toddler for a mile along that lake, and an entire discipline spent half a century certain she could not have existed. Number 6. The humans who were still here. Number 5. The humans who were still here. On an Indonesian island in 2003, a team digging a cave floor uncovered a skeleton that was the wrong size. What that skeleton turned out to be would dismantle the idea that our species has been alone on this planet for as long as anyone thought. The remains came out of Liangbua Cave on Flores, an adult female standing about 106 centimeters tall with a brain case of roughly 426 cubic centimeters. That is a third the volume of a modern human brain. The bones were not fossilized or mineralized. The layers they came from dated to around 50,000 years ago. 50,000 years is not the deep past in hominin terms. Not 2 million years ago. Not a contemporary of Homo erectus in Africa. Not an ancestor at all, on the standard reading, but a separate small-bodied human species, alive on an island at the same time modern humans were painting caves in Europe and crossing into Australia. Alone is how the last chapter is taught, and the wording is usually explicit. Other human species existed, they died out, and by the late Pleistocene, Homo sapiens was the only one left standing. The chart in the textbook narrows to a single line. The rise of behavioral modernity, the settlement of every continent, the whole story of what happened next is told as the story of one species with no living relatives, and the loneliness is presented as one of the defining facts about being human. And somebody else was still here alongside us. The record then produced more of them rather than fewer. Homo luzonensis was described from Callao Cave in the Philippines in 2019, another small-bodied hominin on another island, dated to at least 50,000 years ago. Neither species descends from the other. Neither was predicted. Neither appears in any chart drawn before the excavation that found it. And the Flores skeleton generated an argument that has run for 2 decades, because the alternative reading is that the individual was a modern human with a pathological condition, microcephaly, or a growth disorder, rather than a distinct species. That objection has been tested repeatedly. The wrist bones are primitive in a way no modern human pathology produces. The shoulder, the foot, the jaw all carry archaic features that a disease does not create. And there is more than one individual, from layers spanning thousands of years, all of them the same size, which no pathology produces across a population. Somebody else was on that island. Somebody else was on Luzon. Somebody else was small, and there turned out to be more of them than anybody had predicted. The islands are what makes it structural rather than anecdotal. Flores is separated from mainland Asia by deep water that stayed deep even at the lowest sea levels of the Ice Age, which means whatever ancestor arrived there crossed open ocean to do it, and did so at least 1 million years ago, based on stone tools found elsewhere on the island. Islands are also where the evidence survives, because caves on tropical islands preserve bone that would dissolve in open ground. So the two most recent additions to the human family tree both come from the small fraction of Southeast Asia that happens to have limestone caves in it, and both were found within 16 years of each other after a century in which nobody was looking. Which makes the mainland the problem rather than the islands. Island Southeast Asia is a fraction of 1% of the land area those populations could have occupied, and that fraction alone produced 2 entirely new human species in under 2 decades of excavation. The rest of the region has almost no cave preservation and almost no systematic survey anywhere in it, which means the sample is not small so much as almost entirely absent. How many small-bodied populations were living on the mainland, and what would be left of any of them after 50,000 years in tropical soil? Nothing at all, which is the answer nobody wants. Tropical conditions destroy bone within centuries in open ground, and both species found so far survived only because they happened to die inside limestone. Somebody else was small. 2 separate human species were alive alongside us while we were painting Lascaux, and both were found by accident, on islands, in the only kind of ground that would have kept them. Number 7. The Art with No Beginning. Number 4. The Art with No Beginning. By torchlight on a French cave wall, somebody drew a herd of horses with a confidence that arrives thousands of years too early. What the dating on Chauvet returned would dismantle everything the 20th century assumed about how human art came to exist at all. The cave was found in 1994 in the Ardèche, sealed behind a rockfall, holding more than 1,000 images. Lions, rhinoceroses, bears, and a panel of 4 horses drawn in overlapping perspective, with shading used to build depth into the rock. Radiocarbon dates on the charcoal put the oldest of them at around 36,000 years. That puts these images near the beginning, not mid-tradition, not the mature phase of a developed style, not a refinement of anything earlier, because there is almost nothing earlier, and not a stage on the way to Lascaux, which was painted 17,000 years later and is not more sophisticated. Progression is the assumption underneath the entire way art history is taught. Techniques accumulate. Each generation inherits what the last one worked out and adds to it. The story of representation runs from the crude to the refined, from stick figures to perspective, to shading to naturalism. And the sequence is treated as so obvious that it is rarely stated. Children draw badly and get better. Cultures are assumed to do the same thing over a longer span. There is no learning curve anywhere at Chauvet. Nothing precedes it that would explain it. No cruder version in a nearby cave, no sequence of attempts on the same wall, no apprentice work anywhere in the record leading up to it, and no gradual improvement afterward either, because European cave art across the following 20,000 years does not get steadily better. It varies. Some later work is less accomplished. The Chauvet horse panel uses stump shading, where charcoal is smudged with a finger or a pad to model volume, and perspective, where overlapping outlines place animals at different distances. Both are techniques that art history places tens of thousands of years later. Some of the panels were prepared, with the wall scraped clean before drawing. Some animals are drawn in sequence to suggest motion, multiple heads on one body, an effect that reads as animation when a torch moves across the wall. There is no first attempt anywhere in that cave. There is no wall of practice. There is only work that already knows what it is doing. Somebody knew what they were doing. Somebody had done it before. Somebody taught them, and the record contains no trace of any of it. The dates were fought over for exactly this reason, and the fight is instructive. When Chauvet was published, a significant part of the field rejected the early dating, on the grounds that images this sophisticated could not be that old, which is an argument from the model rather than from the evidence. The objection was that the style belonged to a later period, so the dates must be wrong. More than 80 radiocarbon determinations have since been made, on charcoal from the drawings, and on torch marks, and on animal bones on the floor, and the cave was sealed by rockfall around 21,000 years ago, which caps everything inside it. The dates held. The model was the thing that was wrong, which turns the absence itself into the finding. Painted caves survive because they are caves, sealed and stable and dark, and Europe happens to hold an unusual concentration of the right limestone. Everything ever drawn on hide, bark, wood, sand, or skin is gone, and everything drawn in the open air is gone with it, which is almost certainly the overwhelming majority of what was ever made by anybody. What would the sequence look like if the perishable work had survived? And how much of what gets called the beginning of art is only the oldest thing that happened to be indoors? Nothing else was ever going to last. Of the roughly 400 decorated caves known across Europe, almost all sit in two regions with the right limestone, and the rest of a continent full of people left nothing at all. Somebody taught them. The oldest sophisticated art anybody has is sophisticated because it survived, not because it came first, and no version of the record could show the difference. Number 8. The coastline nobody has dug. Number 3. The coastline nobody has dug. 20,000 years ago, the sea was 120 meters lower, and the places people lived are now underwater. What that single fact does to the archaeological record removes most of human prehistory from anywhere that anybody has ever looked for it. At the last glacial maximum, enough water was locked in ice sheets to drop global sea level by around 120 meters. Continental shelves that are now seabed were dry land. Britain was joined to Europe. Siberia was joined to Alaska. The exposed area worldwide ran to millions of square kilometers, and much of it was coastal plain. Coastal plain is where people go, not the mountains, not the deserts, not the high tundra, where a great many surviving Paleolithic sites happen to be. Human populations concentrate on coasts and rivers because that is where the food and the water and the travel all are, and every Ice Age coastline on Earth is now under the sea. The map of prehistory looks the way it does because of where survey happens. Sites are found on land, by people walking ground and digging test pits and watching construction sites. The distribution of known Paleolithic sites tracks the distribution of dry, stable, accessible terrain almost perfectly. That distribution is then read as the distribution of ancient population, and the story of where people lived is assembled from it. The sample is only ever the land that stayed dry. Nothing about that sample was chosen. No survey selected for it. No strategy corrected for it. No archaeologist ever decided the interior mattered more than the coast. The bias is invisible, precisely because it produced a map that looks finished. Doggerland is the exception that shows the size of the problem. The land bridge between Britain and Denmark covered around 46,000 square kilometers and supported a substantial Mesolithic population, and everything anybody knows about it comes from objects dredged up by fishing trawlers by accident. There has never been a systematic excavation of any of it, because excavating a landscape under 40 meters of the North Sea is a different problem from digging a field, and nobody has solved it. Barbed antler points come up, mammoth bone comes up, a human skull fragment came up once. Somewhere under there is a complete record. Somewhere under there are the sites that would join up the ones on land. Somewhere under there is the answer to how people moved across Europe, and none of it is reachable with the methods the discipline was built on. The migration routes are what this quietly takes apart, one at a time. The peopling of the Americas, the settlement of Australia, the spread along the southern coast of Asia, every one of them is argued from land sites, and every one of the routes proposed runs along coasts that no longer exist. The coastal migration hypothesis for the Americas is now the leading model, and the evidence for it is almost entirely indirect, because the beaches those people walked are 100 meters down and tens of kilometers offshore. The strongest current explanation for how an entire continent came to be settled rests on a landscape from which nobody has excavated a single site, and probably never will. Every land site is being asked to speak for a coastline nobody can see. So the record is not incomplete in the ordinary way that every record is always incomplete. It is missing one specific and entirely predictable part, the part where the most people lived, and it is missing that part everywhere on Earth simultaneously. Underwater survey exists, but it is slow and expensive and covers almost nothing, and the equipment needed to do it properly is owned by oil companies rather than universities. How much of human prehistory is sitting offshore right now, on land that was walked for tens of thousands of years? And what would the map look like if any of it had stayed dry? Nobody will see that map. Sea level has been stable for roughly 6,000 years, which is the only reason coastlines feel permanent. Somewhere under there is a complete record. The story of where human beings lived is told from the fraction of the world that stayed above the waterline, and there is no way to check it against the fraction that did not. Number 9. The layer that should not exist. Number 2. The layer that should not exist. In a Greenland ice core, a layer laid down 12,800 years ago contains something that should not be in ice. What that layer may record is a catastrophe that no accepted version of the prehistoric timeline has ever had the slightest room in it for. The layer sits at the start of a period called the Younger Dryas, when the northern hemisphere dropped back into near glacial conditions within a few decades after thousands of years of steady warming. Sediments from that same boundary, in dozens of separate locations across 4 continents, contain platinum spikes, magnetic microspherules, and nanodiamonds. Platinum does not concentrate like that on its own. Neither do microspherules, which form when material melts and cools at speed. Nanodiamonds need pressures that geology does not casually supply, and none of it appears above or below, only in a band a few centimeters thick, in the same position on separate continents. Prehistory is taught as a story without events. Climate changes gradually. Species drift toward extinction over millennia. Cultures develop through slow accumulation and slow diffusion. The whole discipline was built in reaction to catastrophism, the 19th century idea that the past was shaped by floods and disasters, and it settled instead on uniformitarianism, the principle that the same slow processes we see today are what shaped everything. Sudden events belong to mythology, not to the record. Something happened at that boundary very fast. No slow process accounts for the layer. No volcanic mechanism produces that platinum ratio. No wildfire regime deposits nanodiamonds. No known process on the planet puts all 3 together. No gradual climate shift explains why the North American megafauna, mammoth, mastodon, giant sloth, dire wolf, disappear at almost exactly this horizon, or why the Clovis toolkit vanishes from the archaeological record at the same time. The impact hypothesis proposes that a fragmenting comet struck or airburst over the northern ice sheets, and the case has been argued in the literature since 2007 without resolution. It has never been proved. It has never been dismissed either. It has strong supporters with peer-reviewed data and strong critics with peer-reviewed rebuttals. Independent teams have failed to replicate some of the markers at some of the sites. Other teams have found them at new sites. No crater has been identified, though an airburst would not necessarily leave one. Something is in that layer. Something put it there in a very short window. Something happened at the exact moment 3 separate records break at once. The 3 records breaking together is what keeps the argument alive. A climate reversal, a megafaunal extinction, and the disappearance of a continental tool tradition all land within the same few centuries, and under a purely gradualist reading that is a coincidence of 3. The conventional explanations exist, and they are reasonable. The cold snap can be produced by meltwater flooding into the North Atlantic and shutting down ocean circulation. The extinctions can be attributed to hunting pressure combined with climate stress. The Clovis disappearance can be read as cultural change. Each explanation works on its own. What none of them does is explain why all 3 happened at once, and the impact hypothesis is the only proposal on the table that attempts to, which leaves the field in a position it is not built for. The evidence is real, contested, replicated in some hands and not in others, and pointing at an event type that the entire methodology was designed to rule out. Nobody has proved an impact, and nobody has ruled one out either, 18 years in. The methodology was designed on the assumption that events like this do not happen, which makes it poorly equipped to recognize one if it did. What would it take to settle this? And what else in the record has been read as gradual, because gradual was the only reading on offer? Nothing is settled and nothing is moving. The anomaly has been reported at more than 20 sites on 4 continents, and the disagreement is not about whether it exists, but about what put it there. Something is in that layer. 12,800 years ago, something left a mark in ice, in sediment, and in the loss of an entire fauna, and the discipline is still deciding whether it is allowed to be an event. Number 10. The record that only survives in the cold. Number 1. The record that only survives in the cold. In a freezer in Boston, a technician is holding a bone powder sample that will rewrite a migration story, and the bone came from a cave. What has come out of that laboratory in 20 years has rewritten almost everything, and it can only ever work in one kind of place. Ancient DNA sequencing became viable at scale in the 2010s, and the results dismantled one migration model after another in the space of a few years. Britain's population turned over by around 90% when the Beaker people arrived. The steppe expansion carried Indo-European languages west. India, Iberia, and the Aegean each got a new origin story. Every one of those studies needed DNA that survived. DNA survives in cold. It survives in dry. It survives in caves and in permafrost and in high-latitude burials. It degrades to nothing in heat and in acidic soil and in humidity. Which is to say, it degrades to nothing across most of the inhabited world. Sample size is the one thing the discipline understood it had to fix. Archaeology spent decades correcting for excavation bias, for the fact that cities are dug more than villages, that stone survives better than wood, that rich burials get published and poor ones do not. Every method's textbook covers it. The move to genetics was supposed to be the escape from all that, a direct read of what actually happened, immune to the preferences of whoever held the trowel. The genetic sample is the most biased one yet. No ancient genome has ever been recovered from most of the tropics. No usable sequence from lowland Amazonia. Almost nothing from equatorial Africa, from most of India, from Southeast Asia outside a handful of cave sites. The overwhelming majority of published ancient genomes come from Europe and the Eurasian steppe, which together hold a small fraction of the human population then or now. Africa is where our species spent the longest stretch of its existence and where the deepest genetic diversity in living people is, and it has produced a tiny fraction of the ancient DNA record because the ground destroys it. So the 20-year revolution that overturned the prehistory of migration overturned it for the cold parts of the world and left the warm parts exactly as unknown as they were before, while the confidence generated in the cold parts was quietly applied everywhere. The ghost lineages keep appearing in the equations. Somebody is missing from the record. Somebody is only detectable as a shadow in living genomes. Somebody spent the whole of prehistory in the places where nothing keeps. The corrections keep running in one direction, and that is the part worth noticing. Every one of the facts in this list arrived the same way. A method got better, a place got dug, a sample got sequenced, and the previous answer turned out to be too simple and too recent and too clean. Neanderthals were separate until they were not. The Americas were 13,000 years old until they were 23. Human species numbered one until they numbered several. Art began crude until it began finished. The Sahara was ancient until it was recent. Not one major revision in 20 years has made prehistory shorter, simpler, or emptier. Every single one has made it older, more crowded, and more complicated than the version taught the year before. So the honest position is not that the picture has gaps in it. It is that the picture is the fraction that survives in cold, dry ground, and every correction has run the same direction, which is not what a converging estimate looks like. It is what a floor looks like, and floors get found by being hit. What is the real shape of the thing underneath? And how would anybody standing inside the record be able to tell? Nobody can tell from inside it. Most ancient genomes published come from Europe and northern Eurasia, and there is no technical prospect of that changing where the ground destroys DNA. Somebody is missing. The prehistory taught right now is the prehistory of the places that kept evidence, and there is no version of it that ever gets corrected. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.